Okay, I think we will begin now. I think. Okay, so first of all, I would like really to welcome you all and thank everyone for attending today. My name is Mohammed Al-Amri. I'm a senior research fellow in rehabilitation engineering and movement analysis at Cardiff University School of Healthcare Science in the UK, and the ISVR Journal Club lead. It is my honor and privilege for me today to welcome you on behalf of the ISVR board to this Journal Club, and I hope you will enjoy the Journal Club today. And at this stage, I would like to introduce Martina, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Bioengineering of Catalonia in Barcelona. Martina's research interest lies in the mechanisms that underlie motor and cognitive recovery after a stroke, and the exploration of technological advances in immersive virtual environment, physiological measurements, and mobile applications. This interest aimed to discover neuroscientist principles that underlie human cognition, behavior, and learning, which can be used to design, build, and validate novel neurorehabilitation tools in virtual reality. So Martina's presentation today, it's about adaptive conjunctive cognitive training in virtual reality for chronic stroke patients. So without any further delay, I will hand over to Martina. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. So hello everybody. Lovely to be here today with you and present you this paper that we published last year. As Mohammed already announced, in this study, we investigated whether we can use virtual reality to provide cognitive training for chronic stroke patients. So stroke continues to be a large burden for society in general. Although numbers are luckily declining, we still have over 13 million new strokes each year. And also, of course, acute care has improved, but that, on the other hand, leaves us with a lot of people that survive a stroke. That is good, but they all need also help to recover their functions. Many of them, of course, have physical deficits. So they have, for instance, hemiparesis and therefore difficulties to perform their activities of daily living. But also a majority of them have faced cognitive issues or even have mental deficits. So how do current therapies address this burden? Well, of course, we have physical therapy that focuses very much on improving the patient's body functions and help him to independently achieve the activities of daily living, like bathing himself or feeding himself. But when we look at what is understood under physical therapy and how effective it is, we see that there's a variety of treatments that fall under it, and the effectiveness is not so clear. So there's some clear evidences for some of them, like, for instance, modified constraint-induced movement therapy, but for others, the evidence remains not so clear. Then on the other hand, and quite separate, so most of the time, we have cognitive rehabilitation, which in itself is also consisting of very heterogeneous interventions. And also they're very domain specific, so they focus on specific deficits that patients might occur. And also here, if you look at the effectiveness, we see that it's quite varied. So we have maybe some evidence that intervention that dedicate themselves to attention might have some impact on the patient's abilities, but we have less evidence so for memory or executive functioning. So what becomes maybe clear from that picture is that those therapies that we currently have are very impairment focused, so very specific on an impairment that the patient faces. And that is a bit puzzling because we actually know that physical and cognitive deficits do interact. So a patient that has a lower cognitive status typically also shows a lower motor improvement. So looking at them separately might not be the best approach. Also, if we look at actually the brains of the patients that we intend to treat, here we look at a study of Corbetta that took a large sample of very heterogeneous stroke patients, general cohort that you will find in any hospital. And they did an fMRI on those patients, and they overlapped the lesions, the locations of the lesions these patients had. They found clusters. So there are some areas of the brain that are more likely to be affected by a stroke. But more interestingly, when then they looked what kind of deficits these heterogeneous patients would express, they saw that many patients had a lot of like up to 5 domains or deficits, or displayed up to 5 deficits at the same time. And there's some areas that are more prone to lead to several deficits at the same time. They did a clustering on those deficits, and what they saw is that, for instance, if a patient has a lesion in the left hemisphere, of course, you would expect to see an impairment in the right body parts, but also we would see some cognitive deficits that may arise. So what can we learn from these studies? Well, on one hand, in a large cohort, we see that lesions do overlap, and those regions seem also to lead to multiple deficits that are multi-domain, so they span physical and cognitive deficits. But even apart from that, even if you think like, well, what does it not require you to perform your activities of daily living? Imagine you want to take your car and drive to a shop to buy your groceries, right? You don't need only attention to do that. You don't need only memory to do that. So you might need to pay attention to the traffic around you, to the people that are crossing the street, but you need to remember where the shop is and what you need to buy at the same time. Also, you might need to do quick decisions, right? You might encounter obstacles in your way, or you might have to do a detour. So you need to execute the functionality. Also, you have to pay attention to the mirrors that you have in front of you, the backside. You have to maybe pay attention to cars next to you. So you have to use your spatial awareness to accomplish that task. So although these are different abilities that you have, they have to work together in order for you to perform well in your daily life. So maybe a better approach in rehabilitation is to provide a training that addresses those abilities together in order to enable the patient to perform goal-oriented actions. Another important aspect that is often underlooked or not so much investigated in relationship with cognitive impairment is the occurrence of post-stroke depression. And this is also surprising because we know that people with post-stroke depression have lower cognitive abilities, although we don't know how this relationship actually emerges and how it can be ameliorated. And also we don't know so much about how therapy would influence post-stroke depression per se. So in this work that I can present you today, we actually wanted to look at these two aspects. So first, we wanted to see whether it is possible to provide a training paradigm that could address various cognitive deficits in a heterogeneous group of stroke patients. And secondly, we wanted to see how does depression come into the picture? How does it interact with the cognitive impairment? And how does it interact with the conjunctive training that we are providing? In order to address these two questions, we reverted back to the rehabilitation gaming system. It is a system, it's a VR-based system that our group has been investigating for, well, almost 2 decades, 20 years now. And we have been looking into how we can help patients to recover mainly motor functions. So in that system, or that system consists of a Kinect that tracks the movement of the upper limbs of the patient, and then maps them to a virtual avatar while the patient is executing various tasks. And all those tasks, they require the patient to perform goal-oriented actions. Also, because the patient experiences the games from a first-person perspective, he's actually observing his own execution of the movement. So he has an implicit feedback about his performance. We can also modulate which arm to use during the training, so we can reinforce the patient to use the paretic limb as much as the healthy limb. We can provide variable practice, so we can have different types of tasks that require different types of movement and that can be tailored to the patient needs. And we can adjust the difficulty to the ability of the patient optimally and also automatically. And we can provide multisensory feedback. So the patient is not only visually does not only receive visual stimuli, but also receives auditory feedback about his performance. So these elements that I show here, we term them principles of learning because they have not only shown to be beneficial in learning in humans, but also they go way back to studies of animal behavior. And actually, we have also shown that similar systems that also incorporate these principles of learning have a superior effect in recovering of body function or activity beyond what standard care can provide. So here in this work, we would like to extend the system that we currently have and going specific into adapting the difficulty. So why do we want to use adaptive difficulty? Well, we know that learning is optimal or is best when the person is experiencing the optimal challenge level. What does that mean? Imagine you're playing a game, a video game, for instance, right? So if that video game is too easy for you, you give up quickly because it's not interesting for you. So you actually don't achieve maximum performance, and also your learning might be very low. However, if you experience a video game that is super difficult for you, you might also give up because you cannot achieve the performance you wish for, and also your learning curve remains low. However, if the video game is challenging for you, meaning it's neither too difficult and neither too easy, then it's when you perform actually optimally, and that's also when you learn the most. So we were thinking we could maybe use this optimal challenge point and address various cognitive deficits, because we can have the system adapt the difficulty to the different abilities or disabilities that a patient has, for instance, in attention, memory, executive function, or neglect or spatial awareness. And then we would like to see whether that actually helps the patient to recover. So in order to do so, we developed 3 different new scenarios. 2 of them are adaptive and 1 is not. So the first one, the sphere where it's cognitive, is a non-adaptive training scenario. Here we just wanted to control how the patient is interacting with the game, and it's kind of a basic attention or memory training that just warms up the patient to the training paradigm. So here we don't adapt any parameters to the disability or to the ability of the patient. In our second training scenario, which we call the stars collector, here the patient is exposed to star constellations, and then some of those stars in that constellation light up in a certain order. The patient has to remember the order of those stars, and after a short delay period, reproduce them by you moving his arms accordingly. Here we can modulate several factors. For instance, we can modulate the working memory load by increasing the number of stars that the patient has to remember. We can also manipulate memory delayed recall, because we can manipulate the time the patient needs to maintain the order of the stars in his memory. And we can manipulate spatial attention, because the constellations can be very simple, as we saw here in the video, which are only 3 stars, or it can be very complex, comprising of more and more stars that cover actually the whole workspace. Our third task, we call the quality controller task, is really a dual task paradigm. So here the patient has to take care, on the one hand, of donuts and make sure they don't burn, So here's a clock and he has to save them. And on the other hand, he has a machine that produces candies or little cakes. He sees always which cake is produced. But we always tell the patient, well, the machine is a bit stupid and sometimes it makes mistake and produces a wrong candy. And this candy the patient has to then push away from the conveyor belt. So here we can also manipulate various parameters and adapt them to the patient's ability. We can, for instance, influence how often the candy type changes and how many of good and bad candies are in the sequence, while he also has to take care of the donuts. We can also manipulate the speed of how these tasks have to be performed, so how fast the donuts have to be saved and how fast the cakes move over the conveyor belt and how fast the change happens. So this deploys selective attention, alertness, and also like vigilance, of course, the working space. And of course, because of the spatial outlet, he first of all is also moving both limbs, and he has to like constantly shift his attention to one or the other space. So then we wanted to see, well, we need to test it on stroke patients. So we run a randomized controlled trial, and we were able to recruit 30 chronic stroke patients with a cognitive deficit on the MoCA scale below 22. And actually we achieved a quite heterogeneous group. So you see here that 10 patients that we had all cognitive domains affected, whereas very few had like one domain affected, or we had actually some patients that had no domain affected. We then also looked like how did our sample vary across severance, and we saw that within each cognitive domain we had a quite nice distribution of different severance levels. So we had a very heterogeneous group of stroke patients here that is very representative of what you typically would encounter in a hospital. We then randomized our participants in two groups. We had one group that trained with the adaptive difficulty paradigm. So they trained with these 3 tasks that I showed you before, with these parameters adapting automatically to their ability. And we had another group that did standardized cognitive tasks at home for the same amount of time. So they had no difficulty that adapted to them, but it was given by the standard task that they had to do. As for the protocol, both groups were assessed at baseline. Then they performed a 6 weeks training where they trained every weekday for 30 minutes. And after the treatment, we evaluated them again, as well as a 3 months follow-up. So the outcome measures that we obtained, our main outcome measure was a neuropsychological test battery that spanned the whole range of cognitive functions. And from that battery, we were able to obtain composite score that were standardized to a normative population. So for each cognitive domain, we received one ASCS score. And from that, we can also obtain a generalized cognitive function score. So this is our main outcome. But we also had, of course, control evaluations. We had the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which was used for the screening or the inclusion of the patients. We had the Bartle Index, the Fugl-Meyer, the Mini Mental State Examination, and as well the Hamilton Depression Scale. So first, we wanted, of course, to see, well, does our paradigm work? How does it adapt to the difficulty to the patient's impairment? So what we see here is the difficulty level achieved in the constellation game. So we see the complexity of the constellation. So 1 meaning a very simple constellation, 7 a very complex constellation. And we have stratified the patients according to their severeness level in the spatial awareness domain. And we see that at the start of the treatment that patients with a severe impairment have, of course, lower difficulty levels, so they have more easier constellations, whereas patients with none or mild impairment have more complicated constellations. But we also see that there's a trend that, independent of their severity level, more complicated star constellations were achieved at the end of the treatment. But now, of course, the most interesting part is, well, was it optimal? So here we see the success rate, and we see that independent of their severeness level, all patients were able to train on a success rate of 70%. So the performance that they perceived were the same for everybody. So they all thought, well, I'm actually performing well, and I'm actually like achieving a quite good performance. So how did that translate to the composite scores that were our primary outcome? So for the greens that are our experimental group, the ones that trained with the adaptive paradigm, we saw that after follow-up, they improved as well in attention, spatial awareness, and generalized cognitive functioning, which we did not observe in our control group that did the standardized tasks without adaptive difficulty at home. So this is a very nice result, I think, that we got in 3 out of 5 domains. Then we also found in the subgroup analysis that the adaptive difficulty group, our experimental group, improved or lowered their depression level after the treatment and at follow-up. And this was significantly different from the control group. So there seems to be an influence of the training on the depression level as measured by the Hamilton scale. Moreover, we wanted to see how it interacts with the cognitive impairment, and we passed the values of the improvement of the different cognitive domains to a linear mixed effects model, and we see that the improvement in attention or in memory moderately or significantly influenced whether or not patients would improve within depression. So overall, we think that this is was a quite nice results that we got. Of course, a small sample, but it was for sure a very, very heterogeneous group that we have here, very representative, and that's very encouraging because we can see that with one simple paradigm, we can address a variety of patients without being too specific on their impairment that they have. Moreover, we saw that we can actually provide an optimal training, meaning on an optimal challenge point that gives them the perception of optimal performance, that they can perform well. It's not too easy and it's not too hard for them. So the system is able to adapt the training to the capacity of the patient. And we saw that we have some effect on the cognitive abilities of those patients. So the experimental group showed an improvement in 3 out of 5 domains. And we also saw that there is some modulation on depression. So the training with the adaptive mapping, with the adaptive difficulty actually had some positive outcome on the depression level. And also we could learn something about how the improvement in cognitive deficits does relate to depression, meaning that memory improvement and attention improvement might have a positive relationship with depression. So how do we go from here? Well, knowing that we have now a tool that we can also address cognitive deficits and a variety of them, we of course want to see also how it specifically interrelates with physical deficits. Because the group that we had here, they had not such prone or not so pronounced physical deficits. We want to extend that. And we are currently working on bringing this system really to the patient's home, because what we believe in is that such a simple paradigm actually can be can have the most benefits actually where the patient is, and that is after he finishes the treatment in the hospital and goes home. And here we mainly build on new technologies, or well, new is not so new anymore, but mobile phones and using wearables where we can really fine track the patient movements while he's also performing his daily activities, and then see how that correlates to the training that we provide to the patient. So with this, I would like to close my current presentation. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. Also, please don't hesitate to contact and to connect with me on LinkedIn or on ResearchGate. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and now I'm open for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martina. It's a very interesting presentation. So we are open for any questions. So if anyone has any questions, just feel free really to unmute yourself and just ask the question, or please feel free to write it down into the chat box. Sorry, the question and answer box doesn't work today. There's a question. How many sessions did your patients perform?
So overall, it was 30 sessions. So it was 5 times a week, so every weekday, over 6 weeks. And so it was 30 sessions per training scenario. So 90 in total for each, yeah.
Can you further develop what the standardized training was that your patients were doing?
So the patients, together with the neuropsychologist, we were thinking like, what would people typically do, or what would they typically receive when they go home? And with her together, we compromised a set of tasks, so that are like simple, like memory training tasks, like for instance, connect the numbers or find the errors in the pictures, finish the sentences. So typical tasks that people are given when they are asked, what can I do to train my cognitive abilities? You might have seen them as well as tasks that you might find in mobile phones that are like small cognitive tasks like puzzles, word games. And of that, we made like paper and pencil tasks out of them, and we gave them those folders with a variety of tasks. And every day they were asked to pick one task and try to solve it during the same amount of time, so 30 minutes as the experimental group.
Okay, another question. Can you provide more details in terms of the content of the training for the control group?
So the control group, that is what I talked before. So they received this folder with control for intervention fidelity. Fidelity, what do you mean exactly?
Oh,
with
no,
fidelity?
There's another question I think it has been, it's just one before this one, which is, can you provide more details in terms of the content of the training for the control group?
Okay, so yeah, so this was what I described before, the folder with like standardized or small training, cognitive training tasks that could be puzzles or connect the numbers, detect the errors. So there were like paper and pencil tasks on sheets of paper that we made like, I think 40 tasks that we gave them. So every day they could pick out a task and try to solve it during the same amount of time as the experimental group. And they were requested to write down how much time they spent and when they were trying to solve it. And then they had to give us back those filled out sheets.
Okay, so thank you. I think the next question is about did you control for intervention fidelity on the control group?
So fidelity meaning in like whether they adhered, right? I understand. So yes, so they had to like provide us when they, after their intervention ended, they have to provide us with the folders, and when they wrote down when they did the task and how much time it took them, so that we made sure that they used the 30 minutes. We realized that some tasks actually took them less time, but except for 2 patients, all of them actually did the tasks. So they might have missed 1 or 2 tasks, but they were really doing it. So we have received all of them. That 2 patients failed to do, I think, 1/3 of the tasks. But we later found out that they were also, for them it was difficult to keep it up to doing at home. And that's also an important indicator, because we often think it's easy that people do things at home, and it's actually not that easy that people just do things by their own. And it is something that we will consider for future work as well.
Okay, another question here. Can a stroke patient recover completely after treatment, or can relapse occur after some time?
Well, that's a big question, right? It's not well yet understood. So what we at least have been looking at, the 3 months we had to follow up. So people seem to have recovered even after the absence of training, but how long that this remains and whether there's any relapse, for this we would really need longer studies, like 1 or 2 years, right, to see whether this training, that this boost that you get from the training would maintain. From what I think is generally known, that then other factors might come into play. So people might develop dementia, or they might develop Alzheimer's, which then can confound as well whether people actually deteriorate or not. But I think the only way to address this is doing like long-term research.
You're right. Another question here, where was the intervention with the RGS held? At home as well?
No, so the adaptive mapping group, the experimental group, did the training in the hospital, in the station there, because we needed to make sure that also, because it's a computer, and we realized that some people have maybe a bit of computer, because we have elderly people here, right? So they are not so comfortable if, you know, you just put a system there without guidance. So since it was a clinical trial, we held that part in the hospital. So in any case something would happen, the clinician would be there to help, for instance, technical issues or anything. But apart from that, the patients interacted independently, or like, yeah, independently with the system.
May I follow this up here in another question? Have you tried then to ask the patient, or to explore whether patients try to set them up themselves, just to see whether they are able to use the technology while they are doing?
Yes, so it was actually quite interesting. It depends very much on the patient, of course. So this is not, it's just observation. But we typically like instructed the therapist to like at least, you know, position the patient and help them to put on the markers so the Kinect can detect. But actually some patients were quite independent. They just went into the room, they put on the markers by themselves, sat down and played, and then they left. So some patients are really capable of doing it, and others, of course, require help.
So did you have any, from this observation, did you have any lessons learned which is you can share in terms of like what we could really consider when we need to design some similar research? Because I think given the current situation, I think we would love really, I think, now to take all our research, especially in virtual rehab, to home. I think, like what you said, exactly, this is what I found in my research. It's very challenging really to have the patients set themselves up. I haven't done it yet, but this is where it's like, it would really be good to hear any lessons you learned from this.
So, I mean, we are currently doing this. So with the study that I mentioned in the beginning, the future, we are actually trying to do that right now. So we have a trial running where we bring systems to the patient's home, and with a wearable, with a mobile, with a desktop. And it is quite challenging. Yes, it is. But I think what the best learning is, make it as easy as possible to understand for them. Like we now, for instance, got rid of the markers, so we don't need these markers anymore. So patients can just, you know, plug and play, like, so they can have like a computer that they can click one button and then they can just move. And I think it falls and stands with that. The most easiest approach is most of the time the best approach. A one solution approach works most of the time the best. And a good onboarding also helps, because it's always the first step. So what we learned is that having maybe in the beginning a therapist, teaching them how to use the system in the hospital, just familiarize them with the system, like, look, that's how it works. If something breaks, you can call me, there's a number, don't worry, look, I show you how the game works. Then typically you lose that barrier, and then they feel way more comfortable to also have it at home and play at their own speed and time. But I think for the current generation, as well as we have, it is important that there's a good onboarding, and that it's like a solution that is very fluid, yeah, really plug and play. And I think then you already have, I mean, they want to use the systems. It's not that it just has to be very easy for them. I think that's the biggest learning that we had.
Yeah. The other question, thank you very much for your answers. Is it the adaptive component that explains the differences between the groups or other aspects of training?
Yeah, I mean, this is always, let's say, the remaining question, right? So we checked for sure whether people would, that's why we also had these control measurements, Bartlett index and so on. We didn't see any improvement in, like we only saw a small improvement in motor function. So we can exclude that it's just, you know, you got better in the game. Of course, we don't know whether the patient might have been animated to do training at home. We asked them not to do specific cognitive tasks at home, but you can never totally exclude that. It might be that patients got home and interacted with their caregiver more. These are things we cannot exclude. For sure, these patients were chronic, so they didn't have any other rehab or study going on. So they were exclusively for this study. And these people were people that were really out of the rehab for a long time. So most of them like 2 years after their last rehab finished. So, and knowing the sample, they're typically quite sedentary, so they don't do much. So I think we can be quite confident that it is due to our adaptive mechanism and not to other aspects, but 100% certainly we would have to replicate. I would like to actually replicate it in a larger sample as well to see and to control for more factors to see, you know, if we can replicate the results. That would be actually amazing.
Okay, the other question we have at the moment. There are important differences in the intervention beyond the adaptation, supervised versus unsupervised at home, virtual reality versus paper and pencil, and adaptive versus fixed configuration. How can these factors weigh in your findings?
Yeah, so supervised and versus unsupervised at home. So also, though one intervention was in the clinic, it was unsupervised because there was no therapist there that would do the task with them. So the therapist was only advised to put them in front of the computer, and if they needed help, to put on the markers, but then they left them alone. So they had to do also the experimental group had to do the task unsupervised. But yes, what is different is, of course, VR versus paper and pencil. We went for that because we needed to see if also, or we had to, the question was like, what is a good control group, right? We could go in the next step for using virtual reality and non-adapted training paradigms and see whether that would make a difference. Here we went for like the control group that did what typically control groups would do here in Spain, and that is like you're sent home with a bunch of tasks that they tell you would help you. And this, of course, we have to consider. On the other hand, I think it's a good control group because it's what people typically would do, and what we would like to achieve with our interventions is to be better what people typically have to do. But the last aspect, the adaptive versus fixed, that would be one that would be good if we would replicate this.
Okay, thank you very much. So any more questions, please? Just feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to speak, or just write it down on the chat box. Okay. So I think this is very important topic. So any more questions, please, before we wrapping up? Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And thank you very much, Martina, for this presentation. So it's very interesting presentation and very interesting work. So I would like to thank everyone. And if you are interested in presenting at this journal club, so please contact me and we will arrange, I think, the journal club. So our next month will have our seminars. So we will send the details quite soon. So please keep your eyes on the emails. And if you want anything from the ISVR, just please drop us a line. So thank you very much, everyone.